Dark Souls is infamous for being hard. It punishes simple mistakes, actions are permanent, and death is common. Dark Souls 2 is a great follow-up to the franchise, but it doesn't do everything better. If for whatever reason you aren't familiar with Dark Souls 2, it's an adventure RPG with meticulous combat, dangerous exploration, and inevitable death. If you were turned off by demons or Dark Souls 1, you're not going to like this game anymore. You can stop watching right now. If you played those games and enjoyed them, which I'm going to assume you have, Dark Souls 2 does a lot of progressive tweaks and balances to the formula that are, for the most part, better. The new engine itself runs significantly better than either of the two previous games. Slowdowns are much less common, some areas actually have some pretty high frame rates, and the cloth mechanics and lighting are also better. Shadows aren't as good, and I do miss being able to flop around corpses of enemies, but the game does run better in general. But more importantly, it doesn't feel different at all. Despite the engine change, it feels and plays just like Dark Souls. It retains the same combat of knowing when to attack, when to block, when to dodge, and when not to get too overzealous. The same gameplay that made the previous game so great is still here. Most of the tweaks to the gameplay aren't so much in combat as it is everything around it. And honestly, for the most part, a lot of these changes makes the game more accessible. You can use your bonfire to teleport around immediately, which I welcome. Dying and becoming a hollow no longer halves your maximum hit points. Instead, you lose a small portion of it every time you die, about 10% or so. This does make it easier to continue on after death, but dying repeatedly still adds up. A new item introduced is the life gem, which can be used to slowly replenish a portion of your health. It builds very slowly, so it isn't so much of a lifesaver that it can be used in emergencies, but a good alternative to the Estus Flask after a tough battle or a stupid mistake. Also, when playing as a phantom in another player's world, you can use both the Estus Flask or a life gem to heal, though it does so at half its normal speed. Another grand addition that was heavily touted is the torch. You can light a torch at a bonfire to give yourself a light source and to set fire to certain things along your journey. This is conceptually neat, but in the end, I found myself ignoring it. I never saw a huge need for having a torch lit, except for maybe two areas, the Shrine of Amana and the gutter. And while the torch does help those areas, it isn't necessary. The torch can also be used to activate contraptions in the world, but a simple switch or lever would have done the same. Some enemies also fear fire, making them cower into a corner, but only a very small few do that, and they're easy enough to defeat without it. The torch is a novel idea that isn't fully fleshed out, and if it isn't expanded upon in a future installment, it's not worth keeping around. There is significant improvements made to multiplayer sessions, something that was desperately needed. It's been much easier to connect to other players, be summoned, and to invade other players. A new item has been introduced, the name-engraved ring, which allows you to easily connect to other players choosing the same god. It's a neat item that makes it a lot easier for you to find your friends to play with online, and another ring can be used to allow voice chat. It's a small addition, but it has a big impact on enjoying the game more by playing with people you know. I've also found lag to be less of an issue. It still happens here and there, but for the most part, PvP battles are much more accurate than ever before. Although, I do take issue with the new Grey Phantom system. Some areas of the game force you to invade another player's world to kill them. If you kill them, they suffer a normal player death. But as a Grey Phantom, you get no benefit or bonus for killing another player. Because of this, the Belfry Tower areas can waste a lot of time. In fact, I witnessed a large amount of Grey Phantoms willingly throw themselves over cliffs so that they can go back to their own worlds instead of having their time wasted. With all the tweaks and changes, Dark Souls 2 plays a lot better than the previous two games, with some generous allowances. For example, you can now have 3 items equipped per hand, you can equip twice as many rings and twice as many quick items. There was a great fear before it came out that Dark Souls 2 would end up being easier than the previous games. And honestly, it is. That isn't to say that the game isn't challenging, because it still is. But the life gems themselves do not heal that much on their own, but I always had an abundance of them my entire playthrough. The same goes for human effigies, the item you use to restore your humanity. I averaged around having 10 or so on me at any point in time. Enemies still do a lot of damage and can easily kill you if they land a blow, but a lot of them are easily defeated before they can. Even the bosses themselves, which were once a constant highlight in the series, are generally pretty easy. Some of them are complete pushovers. A small few are still kind of tough, yes, but they are overall disappointing. And this is where I began to notice the biggest flaw with Dark Souls 2. It isn't very creative. The areas that you go to are standard for the series. Castles, tombs, and outdoor areas all blend together without an identity of their own. There are a handful of really cool places, the Shaded Forest stands out to me, but for the most part, they were pretty mundane. More disappointing is how every area is connected. You begin in Majula, which acts as a hub to access the different areas. It's much more akin to Demon Souls in that regard. It's a single starting point that has several straight paths shooting off from it. They do have some of their own branches, but they all have the same ending point. Compare that to the world of Dark Souls 1, which felt like a very cohesive place as you're playing through it and unlocking shortcuts and hidden passages, you begin to realize that all these areas you're traveling to are somehow interconnected with each other, making the whole thing feel much more organic. The world of Dark Souls 2 is much larger and much easier to navigate, but not as intricate as it could have been. This isn't that big of a deal, as I still enjoy traversing the world, but I cannot overlook the lack of creativity when it comes to enemies. Bosses in particular. You'll quickly notice that a large majority of the enemies you fight are some type of humanoid of varying sizes and armor. The bosses themselves, aside from being easy to beat, lacked the gravity the previous ones had. Again, a lot of the bosses were some variation of guy with some armor. This isn't to say that the game doesn't have any good bosses, because there are a few, but most of them aren't. It's made even worse that some of them are far too easy to even give the sense of dread that they're supposed to. And some of the best boss fights it has are straight up unchanged repeats from Dark Souls 1. You could argue that these are fan favorites making a return. I'm going to argue that this was lazy. If you consider all that nitpicky, that's fine, but it's an issue I couldn't shake from my head the entire time I was playing it. That being said, it's still a great game. You can sink tons of hours into this. It has so many optional areas and secrets and optional bosses, and the New Game Plus mode thankfully does more changes to the game than just making enemies deal more damage to you. I absolutely enjoyed my time playing it. It does everything better on a technical and mechanical level. It's that lack of creativity in its design that prevents it from ascending above the others. Dark Souls 2 earns an 8 out of 10. If you loved the previous Souls games, you'll love this one. If you want to play a Souls game to see what all the fuss is about, this is the best one to start with. Just as long as you accept that you're going to die.